Okay, good morning and welcome everybody to the Bad Sydney Crime Writers Festival. I'm Jana Wendt and I'm delighted to welcome you to the Dixon Room today. I want to start by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional owners of this land and pay respect to elders past and present. I'll have to go through the usual run of housekeeping, so bear with me. As you will have already seen, we are following COVID protocols. I'm sure you've seen that with the distancing in this room. It means that there are very much limited numbers in this room. Hand sanitizer is available at the door. We ask that you please try to respect these protocols and the standing 1.5 metres away from anyone in your orbit. We're all used to these conventions now, so we'd ask that you please follow them. Please would you mute your mobile phones? Don't record the session. If you're taking photos, please turn off your flash. Also, feel free to share on social media, Bad Crime Sydney, hashtag Bad Crime Sydney. We will have, I should tell you, we will have about 10 to 15 minutes of question time, questions from you. So I don't hog the floor here with our guest. So onto the business of the day. It is my great pleasure to be here today, particularly as it gives me the opportunity to mine the formidably extensive experience of our guest. Many of you would know Nick Kaldas as a former New South Wales Deputy Police Commissioner. Nick served in that position for nearly a decade until 2016. That role and other executive positions he held were preceded by many years in the hard grind of day-to-day police work. Nick's overall experience spans community policing, major crime investigations and operations including counter-terrorism, protection operations, armed robbery and major drug investigations, covert operations, emergency management, and over a decade, significantly over a decade in homicide. All that and more adds up to nearly 35 years in the force. I think you could safely say that Nick had well and truly done the business by the time he got to taking up police executive roles. But beyond that, Nick also has substantial experience in a range of investigations outside of Australia. To mention just a few, in 2016, he was Chief of Investigations in the UN-sponsored effort looking into the use of chemical weapons in the Syrian conflict. He was also Chief of Investigations at the UN Special Tribunal for Lebanon, which examined the assassinations of former Lebanese PM Rafiq Hariri and 21 others. He is currently a member of a committee overseeing a Scotland Yard investigation of crimes alleged to have been committed during the so-called Troubles in Northern Ireland. It's been commissioned, this investigation, by the government of Northern Ireland. Now, I am going to stop there because if I ran through Nick's complete CV, we'd have no time left to ask him any questions, and that is the object of the exercise today. So before we move on to that, can I please ask you to join me in welcoming Nick Kaldas? Nick, we're lucky to have you because of the range of experience that I've just described. And I'm going to take you through a number of fields of your expertise. But here's a very basic thing. They do say that you haven't been a cop until you faced an angry man. Do you remember your first experience of an angry man or woman, should I say, and how you dealt with that?
Thanks, Jana. I just wanted to thank the organisers and you for having me, and for all of you coming out in COVID times, taking the risk and coming out today. But I was just going to say about that introduction. Now, I can't wait to hear myself after that. But I think, thankfully, I haven't seen too many angry women. I've seen, unfortunately, too many angry men. I had a few years in the armed hold-up squad, and I think nearly all the people we arrested in that space were angry. Some of them had to be wrestled, more or less, to get them to where we wanted to get them. I do recall one in uniform. I started at Balmain. That's 40 years next year. And there was a fellow who had gone to a dinner party and with friends at a friend's place, and 6 or 8 people at this dinner party. And it was pre-ice and all these really dangerous drugs. So I don't know what happened to him, but he had a brain snap and he literally just lost it and became incredibly violent. He actually smashed the apartment up before we were called. Televisions, couches, he smashed everything up, and that's when they called the police because he'd had some sort of episode. Eventually, there's quite a number of police turned up, but my workmate and I were the first ones to come through the door, and we couldn't wait for anybody else to turn up. Obviously, we had to act. So we launched, and it was a wrestling match, incredibly physical and violent. It felt like it was half an hour, but I'm told it was more like 5 minutes. I ended up spraining my ankle very badly, which still gives me a bit of grief. I ended up in Royal Prince Alfred Hospital after we finished. My friend had a few bits of bark off him, face-wise and otherwise, but we managed to subdue this fellow eventually and handcuffing, and then other police turned up, and getting him out of the apartment was another battle with his feet going everywhere. We don't have handcuffs for feet, unfortunately. But it's just one of those things. I mean, these poor people who hadn't done anything wrong, they were just sitting there. They count on the police, obviously, to come through and sort of save them from something so, just really violent.
So what's that experience like at that stage of your career? It is literally a blooding, I suppose, but does it change your thinking about the work that you're there to do?
No, I don't think so. I think it's what you train for. It's what you prepare for. It's what all uniformed police do in the beginning of each shift. They gird themselves and get ready basically for that. Could happen any time in a shift. Could happen many times in one shift. I've been to plenty of pub brawls and that sort of thing, domestic situations where someone's gone off their head. You're the sort of the barrier or the filter between these violent people and innocent people who may get hurt, and that's what keeps you going.
On the subject of wrongdoing, violence, is there such a thing, do you think, as pure evil?
I'm not a psychologist, but I'd say yes, and I think there's plenty of people I've arrested or been a part of operations on who would probably fall in that category. People who genuinely did not care about anyone except themselves and had no conscience, no sense of what's right or wrong, no moral compass, and they had their insatiable desire for whatever it was, whether it's rapists or money motivation or whatever. They're prepared to do whatever it was to satiate their desires. I think that's what makes them evil, is because they don't actually care about what their actions are doing to innocent people.
So you think with a person like that rehabilitation is simply out of the question?
I think probably that's right. I think of some of the people we've arrested over the years, murderers particularly. They're unrepentant, no apology. They will never admit to themselves or anybody else that what they did was wrong. And if they had their time over again, I suspect they'd do it all again. So if that's the case, I don't know whether you can ever really reform them. And certainly some of the religiously or politically motivated people who commit violence in that space, the jihadists, I think a lot of them are unfixable. It doesn't mean you stop trying. We must all try to get them back to normal. But I look at some of the people we arrested in counterterrorism here who convinced authorities that they had gotten better and were released from jail, ultimately ending up fighting with ISIS in Syria. They did a snow job on authorities. They convinced them that they were okay, but that they were reformed, but they hadn't, not at all.
Well, that is an area that I want to return to
Sure.
with you a little later on. I mentioned your decade or so in homicide. Obviously, you've just referenced that, and your experience investigating criminal gangs makes you the perfect person to ask about the building blocks of an investigation. If we take perhaps a couple of examples to get a concrete idea of how the process works, if we just, let's say, imagine a criminal gang, a member of a criminal gang is shot dead outside his house. Let's say 2 men are seen taking off by some witnesses, by some neighbours. Police arrive at a scene like that. Can you give us a clue of how an investigation like that would proceed?
Sure. It's probably important to just delineate. There are 2 types of investigations, major crime investigations. There's reactive investigations where something has happened, a fraud, a murder, a rape, something terrible, and then you come in and investigate that. And then there's proactive investigations where you haven't had a call, there isn't necessarily a crime scene, you haven't been told that something bad has happened, but you've got intelligence that gets you to a point where you need to investigate. Organised crime groups, as you said, Jana, Middle East organised crime groups, outlaw motorcycle gangs, ethnic, Russian organised crime groups, or Asian triads, or whatever it might be. The investigative process is similar in some ways, but is also quite different. For the reactive ones, where you've had a call, as they say, the calls come in and then you go out, there are building blocks, absolutely. And they are obviously the physical evidence, the crime scene, the forensic evidence, whether it's a post-mortem or some other medical examination of someone who may not have passed away. There might be ballistic evidence, explosives evidence, the witnesses' statements, the canvassing of the surrounding areas, and then probably one of the most important things is victimology. That's everything to do with your victim, particularly with a murder. You need to find out as much as you can about who hated your victim, who loved your victim, what has he been doing recently, all of these things, the victimology. If you put all these building blocks together, you'll hopefully get a picture of where you need to go with the investigation. And then what happens then is you have quite a number of lines. The murder of John Newman, that I'm not sure if you mentioned it, he's a member of Parliament. He had 97 lines of inquiry when we started out. And over a period of 6-7 years, we actually dwindled that down to one, and then we convicted someone in the end. But there were a lot of people who had clashed with John Newman. I'm sure he was a good man. I didn't meet him, but he was controversial and he advocated things that caused people to threaten him with death and all of that. Everyone who had ever threatened him had to be investigated and eliminated as a suspect, obviously. So I'm sorry to have gone on a bit, but that's the reactive type of investigation. Proactive investigations are very different. And, a lot of people have argued over the years that you're either good at one or the other. I hope I've done both, and I think a good detective should be able to do both. The proactive ones is where you haven't had, the call hasn't come in. You haven't had a crime scene. You haven't had an incident that you can pin your finger on for a date or a time or a place. It might be an organised crime group that you think are up to no good, and therefore you investigate them. And that's where it becomes you have to be imaginative. You have to be able to use your initiative, basically. You work out who the main bad guys are, you work out what it is they're doing, and then you work out what you need to do, whether you need to tap phones, tap houses, seek informants from disgruntled former members, seek enemies who may want to say something about what they're doing, seek victims out, most importantly, to see if they're prepared to tell you whatever it is they've suffered at this group's hands. And you put all that together. And these days, obviously, there's one other vital aspect, which is assets. And it has become, and has been for probably 2 decades now, a very important part of any investigator's armoury, which is to look at people's assets, unexplained wealth, work out, and they do have to answer for that at some stage. The onus has shifted legally, unless it's shifted back in the last couple of years while I wasn't watching. The onus is on someone who's been arrested and charged with criminal matters. It's up to them to prove where all their money came from. Otherwise, there's a good chance it will be confiscated. And I think that asset confiscation stuff, and there's been a swag of legislation come through, and I think a lot of support for it from the public. If you're a criminal, particularly if you've been convicted and it's known that you're a leader of an outlaw motorcycle gang, I don't think anyone should say, yeah, they should keep all the money. They don't have jobs. They don't work at it for a living. This is their living. It's crime. And if we take their assets away, then it really does have an impact on the organisation, on the individual, and perhaps also a little bit of dissuades others from doing what these people have done in some small way.
Let me tackle it from another direction. In some quarters, there is some sensitivity to identifying a criminal gang by the ethnic origin of the criminal gang. Well, where do you stand on that issue?
I have some sympathy for those who say you shouldn't have an Asian crime area or a Middle East organised crime area, but that is what they are. That's the work they do. I don't, if somebody can think of another way to call them, or you can scrub it all together, sure, but I've probably, in my old age, I've probably reverted a bit, and I'm thinking, I don't think those crime squads exist anymore. I think they have changed their names to a more general organised crime name, but I never thought it was actually that big a deal. But some people obviously felt they were being singled out. But the reality was, and this is for me is what should decide what we call it, what is the actual work they're doing? And if it is an Asian crime syndicates that they're investigating, then I don't know why you can't call it the Asian Crime Squad.
Because that's what it is.
It is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. You mentioned before jihadist crimes. What kind of criminality do you think we're talking about in those cases? Is it simply, I mean, in some cases, let's take Australian issues and Australian cases. I mean, are we talking about criminality that's mixed up in the search for money, or what is it? Is there a blurring of the lines, or what's happening?
It's definitely both in Australia and overseas. I would argue that line between pure profit-driven criminality and religiously or politically motivated violence is actually blurring. What we have seen in Australia for some time now is a cooperation, if you like, between criminal groups and those who are jihadists or that way inclined. And perhaps one example is, so just to answer the question specifically, I think they'll be in anything that helps them achieve their goals. So if it's about credit card fraud, motor vehicle rebirthing, whatever it might be, and it helps them cash up so they can do the other stuff, they're happy to do it, and they will find willing partners to do that stuff. And one example is you might recall the case of the missing rocket launchers. That was a classic example of those who were criminally oriented and those who were jihadists. The rocket launchers were stolen from the Australian military by a crooked major who has been charged and convicted and jailed. He had sold them to an organised crime group who sold them to a Lebanese organised crime group who then sold it on to the jihadists. And we had this funny incident where a particular criminal who is not really a jihadist, he's a pure criminal and took some pride in that. We had a conflict between two notable crime groups in the Arabic community, and he got his hands on one of the rocket launchers, went to this fellow's house in southwest Sydney and had it aimed at his house, his enemy that he wanted to take out. And it would have done a lot of damage and killed a lot of people. And eventually one of the people who was in the car with him rolled and became an informant and told us and made statements, and that's how we know exactly what happened. But he looked at his enemy's house, which was a fibro house, and he realised there's a possibility the rocket may actually go through the house and come out the other side where his cousin lived. So he didn't do it simply because he thought it might hurt his cousin. And we're thankful for that. Yeah.
I'm sure you were.
Yeah.
Do you think we know enough about the psychology of an attacker motivated by extreme religious beliefs?
I think Australians generally struggle to understand. We're not apathetic, but we don't care as much about politics as they do in other places in the world. I mean, in the Middle East, I'm Egyptian born and brought up and migrated here as a teenager. I grew up from a very early age. That's all we talked about in the house. It was politics. It was about not just politics in your own country, but politics, our relationship with America, what America was doing in the Middle East. Everybody had a view and everyone felt really passionate. Excuse me. I'm just going to have a very quick drink of water. Talk amongst yourselves.
We will let Nick have a drink of water, but obviously Nick's vast experience means we can range not only through the Australian experience, but lots and lots of insights into his work overseas, and having lived overseas for a period of time. I've padded long enough now, Nick, so you were about to say.
Yeah, sorry, thank you. Thanks for that, the gap filler. The thing is, I think most Australians don't really understand how anyone can feel so angry that they want about politics that they want to go out and kill as many people as they can, which we are sadly seeing all over the world at the moment. In Paris, I think in France there were some attacks recently. There's been attacks in Austria again recently. It's almost a weekly or monthly event where something bad's happening because somebody felt so strongly that they got up off the couch and went and sort of got knives or explosives or whatever. I don't know what we've all struggled with an answer to that, and how we cope with it, how we fix it, how we get these people back on track. I don't think there's any easy answer, but one thing's for sure: government, police in particular, and other government departments have an almost sacred duty to continue to engage with these communities, to continue to try and empathise and understand their aspirations and thinking, to try and deal with this issue. Ultimately, I don't think government can fix this problem. The communities themselves are capable of doing and are doing a great deal in terms of identifying the people who are troubled and then trying to deal with them, trying to fix them from within, families and communities.
Someone might say it is within those communities that these people are born and where they thrive. So where is the line for police? Who do you cultivate, if you like? Who do you cultivate a friendship with to assist you, and who is simply never going to
I think
assist
you've
you?
got to talk to everyone. I mean, for about the last 15 years or so that I was in the police, I led the effort in community engagement, multicultural issues and so on. And you've got to talk to everyone, even if you don't agree with them, even if you think they may be, up to no good, you must engage and you must continue. There was relentless engagement. But just a very, very quick side story. So I went to Lebanon to investigate the assassination of the Prime Minister and other 21 murders that had occurred over 4 years. And I got to know the National Chief of Police quite well. And in one of the many discussions we had, he said to me, we didn't have a really bad radicalisation problem here. You exported it to us from Sydney. He felt that a lot of the problems they have now, Tripoli is a sort of Sunni stronghold in Lebanon, where people who had grown up in southwest Sydney and then had gone back to Lebanon and took that radicalised strain with them and spread it. He feels we've got a real problem here. And I've really struggled to understand that and to work out why. I mean, we live in a very lucky country. We're blessed, and I look at how we've dealt with COVID compared to other places. I look at how we dealt with the last global financial crisis. We're a stable democracy where people can live freely. I mean, we have issues. Of course, we'll have issues, but we deal with them and we can get on with life. I don't know why anyone would be so disgruntled that they feel they have to sort of kill the world or anyone who disagrees with them. I'm not sure I'll ever get my head around that, but it's what we're up against.
Well, indeed, because that is a reality. That thing you of all people, can't get your head around. How are police to deal with that?
If I had the answer, I'd probably make $1 million. But relentless engagement is definitely one, coupled with enforcement. And that must be fearless and unbiased. So if you do get information, regardless of what attacks you may get from community or from media or whatever, you need to do what's right. If you have information, even if it singles out a particular group, you've got to act. And you have that sacred duty to protect the public, obviously, from what the bad guys want to do. But it needs to be the two things. The enforcement definitely must happen. Arrests, operations, investigations, deterring things and preventing. Obviously, prevention is much better than having to deal with it after it's occurred, coupled with the velvet glove of saying we want to engage, we want to hear from you. And I do need to make this point, Jana. Most of the significant operations that have been run in Australia that led to arrests in counter-terrorism, real serious people who had become quite radicalised and were ready to do bad things or had done bad things. Most of the information that led to those arrests often comes from the community themselves. And I don't think that's sort of publicly acknowledged, not enough anyway, because it is people within the communities who feel this isn't right, I'm going to do something. And the British had a series of posters and a program over there called If You See Something, Say Something. And I really like that. It's about saying to the people, if you know something, you've got an obligation to put your hand up and say. You'll be protected, your identity won't be revealed, all that stuff, but all that's in place. There's a national security hotline, all of those things are in place.
Let me just ask you on a personal level, you've mentioned your Egyptian background, Arabic speaking. Obviously that was of assistance in some ways doing the work that you were doing, liaising with these communities that may have been troubled. Did it also mean that certain pressures were applied to you by those communities?
A little bit. There was an expectation that you'd go soft because you are an Arab. There's certainly that. And the other side of that coin is there's a certain amount of racism in government circles, I'd have to say. But I didn't feel ever the sort of pressure that would say, look, you're not going to run this operation, or you're not going to investigate this group, or you're not going to arrest so-and-so just because you're a fellow Arab. The Egyptian community, by and large, I'm sorry to say this, don't get involved in criminal activity. Thankfully, I don't have any, relatives or anything that have been involved in anything. So it'd probably be harder for someone from some of the other groups whose community have real issues.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, let me move to a different part of the world altogether. Namely, I mentioned the fact that you were on this advisory board in relation to a Scotland Yard investigation of murders and other crimes alleged to have been committed during the Troubles in Northern Ireland. Now, we're talking decades and decades ago. What are you looking for to satisfy yourself that an investigation like that, conducted by the English, by the British, is sound?
That's a good question. So Operation Canova, it's Kenova, if anyone wants to Google it, it all comes up. Essentially what happened is there was quite a large number of murders that occurred in Ireland, in Northern Ireland mainly, but some in the south, allegedly committed by the IRA on IRA people because they suspected them of being informants for the British. And you're right, Jana, it spans probably the last 40 years, maybe a little bit longer. What's happened is the victims' families have got together, they got lawyers, and they said that these cases were never investigated properly. No one's ever been arrested, none of them have been solved. They're angry. And Gary Jubilant before me talked about the victims and trying to get them closure and all. None of these people have closure. Some bodies were never found, dead people's bodies were never found. It's quite bad. They began to win the court cases that they launched against the government, and they forced the government of Northern Ireland to reinvestigate all of the murders. Everyone in Ireland has a conflict. Everyone's had a history of being involved in this or that. So they brought in a team from Scotland Yard. They're not actually physically in Ireland, they're in London, but they're back and forth as you do. And because it was so political, they felt they needed an independent steering committee to oversight that investigation. And that's what I'm on. There's 5 or 6 of us. I've got no history of involvement with Ireland. I'm a sort of Middle East guy. I haven't had anything to do with Ireland, so I'm completely independent. I don't have any allegiances or anything else. So we're simply oversighting the investigation. We're ticking off on everything they're doing. And hopefully giving the public in Northern Ireland a reassurance that these murders will once and for all be investigated properly and those who have committed them held to account. Very, very short snapshot about what we're trying to achieve. Obviously they want closure. They want to find the bodies that hadn't been located. Even if they don't result in convictions, they want to know who did it, and they want their names cleared. You might find this strange, but a lot of the families, and we did meet with quite a few of them in Belfast earlier this year, our steering committee, they want those who have been accused of being informants and their loved ones were killed. They're very, very anxious about having their name cleared, that they were not informants. Mm-hmm. That's what they want out of the investigation, that whoever was killed was not, and it's actually most of them were not informants. So the IRA had this thing called the Nutting Committee, and it's a group of guys that get together, there's no women, and they'd say, so-and-so, I think he's a spy. Yeah, I think he's a spy. They'd have a few more drinks and then they'd go and get him and kill him, torture him and kill him. That's basically what they were doing. Turns out the head of the Nutting Committee, whose code name was Steak Knife, S-T-A-K-E, was actually the British informant. He was the one he was feeding. And then it appears that there were cases where certain authorities in the UK said to him, so-and-so's looking at you, they're getting a bit suspicious. You better do something about them. So he'd go and nominate so-and-so and they'd get him killed. Now, you asked me about pure evil. I think that fellow, his name's Fritz Capici, it's been in the media, it's not a secret. Codename Steak Knife is probably one of those people I put in the pure evil category.
Mm. Well, again, let me bring you back to what your role is, this oversight role. You've just described what sounds like a cesspool of criminality. How do you actually make sure that this investigation is headed in the direction that you would want it to head?
So there are obviously lines of inquiry which they report on regularly, they discuss with us. There are some budget issues that we're happy to assist with. We actually wrote at one stage as a group, the steering committee, to the Prime Minister of England, because she had made comments in Parliament attacking the investigation based on very bad advice. It was Theresa May. Some of it is about providing the investigators with top cover to make sure they can get on with the job they need to do, rather than having to worry about the politics and all of that. Ultimately, what we hope to gain, what the operation's aimed at, is giving some semblance of justice to the victims, a considerable number of victims in Ireland for all of these murders. I didn't realise, but the peace agreement in Ireland, which they call the Easter Agreement, because it was worked out over Easter, I might stand corrected, it's either the maximum you can do in jail, no matter what you've done, is 2 or 3 years. So this fellow, I think there'll be quite a number of charges hopefully coming his way. Mm-hmm. The maximum he can do out of those is about 2 or 3 years. But it did bring peace to Ireland.
Okay, once again, let's do a big backflip and come back to Australia. I want to talk to you about an issue that's throwing police ethics here into question, and that is the Lawyer X case that's playing out in Melbourne. This is the case where a barrister representing very high profile criminals, drug barons like Tony Mockbell and the like, was at the same time used by Victoria Police as an informant. Just out of interest, had you ever heard rumours that any such thing was going on in Victoria?
No, I don't think anyone had. I think it was kept very tight, obviously. So if you're looking for positives, at least they kept it a secret. They kept their informant register a secret. I just don't know. I don't know a great deal about it. I only know what I've read in the media. But on the face of it, there's been probably failures of judgment on a number of levels. Certainly at the operational level, people should have known this isn't going to fly. And then at the management level, someone should have been in place to say, hang on a minute. And then at the executive level, if they had oversight, and it looks like they have, it came out in some of the, again, someone should have just said, hang on a minute. It was sort of, seemed to be a little bit of a herd mentality where they were getting valuable information and they just became addicted to it, and perhaps it was very difficult to stop. And not by way of an excuse at all, but they were in the middle of a gang war, which they were finding it very difficult to tackle, to stop it from continuing to happen. We've had issues here with groups sort of declaring war on each other. Maybe we took a different approach. Brothers for Life is one that comes to mind. I led that charge, and within a month we pretty much had them mopped up, but it wasn't using their solicitor as an informant or their Baxter as an informant. There's a lot of dogged work went into it. It's just difficult for me to know exactly what they were thinking, because no one's ever got in the witness box and said, look, we did it because.
But I guess you said, no one said, hang on a minute, but that's a very small way to put something of this gravity. This went on for years and years. From what we know, there was a top-down awareness of this. Well, let me put it to you this way. Is this really off the charts impropriety, or is it something that would be a temptation for any police anywhere who are in a struggle against crime?
I don't think it'd be the sort of temptation that would lure cops who was, thinking about things rationally and sensibly. I haven't heard of it happening anywhere else. So that tells me something. I think it was probably a combination of things. And it's very difficult for sort of former senior cop to attack other senior cops. As Gary would say, what could possibly go wrong with this answer? But the thing is, the tone starts at the top. And that's in everything police do. There's obviously a failure at the very top of the tree where, former Commissioner Nixon couldn't remember being briefed. It turns out she was. I mean, I don't know how you can forget something like this. There's been a bit of a trend in various places where people are being promoted to very senior ranks without actually having done the hard yards and without understanding the core business of the organisation of policing. And I think some of that has happened in Melbourne.
Your Victorian colleagues won't love you probably for that, but...
those who love me will love me, and those who didn't love me before probably hate me a bit more now. So.
All right, let me turn to the talk about anti-corruption bodies in Australia. We've just seen the ICAC hearings here in New South Wales playing out. Now the federal government is proposing a national anti-corruption body. In your view, do we need such a body?
Look, I'm not enough of a politician or a politically aware person to pass judgment on whether we need it or not. But what I do know is if they are going to do it at the federal level, the national level for the whole country, they must think about the experience we've had in New South Wales and other places. And things have run off the rails. One of the cornerstones of our justice system is the right to silence. We've traded that off and we got nothing in return. You are now compelled to go to hearings. They can do them, and the secrecy provisions should be something they have to justify using. They don't. It's just everything they do is secret. And if you want to complain about them, there's no one to complain to. With extraordinary power like that, I've often said there must come extraordinary accountability, extraordinary checks and balances. ICAC not that long ago had completely run off the rails. I look at their thwarted attempt to hunt down Margaret Kineen. I look at their attempt to hunt down Murray Keir, who was the Commissioner of the SES, and his deputy, Steve Pearce. Failed prosecution on Murray Keir, no prosecution on Steve Pearce, ruined their lives. There is no one to really complain to with teeth who can actually pull them in the line. You have these bodies that have extraordinary power and they're unfettered. They have an inspector who's supposed to investigate them. It's usually a retired former Supreme Court judge, let's say in his 80s, who works 2 days a week and really legislatively has no power to tell them what to do. The former Police Integrity Commission was another body. 13 adverse reports about major cases where they've, essentially just completely ruined someone's life unfairly, and the people were exonerated and so on. There is no, they call it the exoneration mechanism. People get named in ICAC as being corrupt, but ultimately there's not enough evidence to charge anyone or go to court. There has to be a mechanism somewhere where that's expunged. I know police who are friends of mine and Gary's and others who have been called bad names by the Police Integrity Commission. If you Google them, it comes up. But the end result was that they were found not to have done anything wrong. So you can't do this to murderers. I mean, this business of taking away the right to silence, police can't do that to murderers, rapists and pedophiles. And yet these bodies are allowed to do it pretty much willy-nilly with no justification. It should be something you pull out as the last resort and you must justify doing it. There is none of that in place.
So that sounds like a bit of a no to the need for such an organisation.
I was going to say I'll get back to you on that, but yeah.
Look, let's skip again. We're sitting here in a room, socially distanced, madly socially distanced. This is what a Writers' Festival looks like at this time. It's lovely to have you all here, but it's a little strange. I think you probably all feel that. Police have been the enforcers of some regulations, some of them very, very harsh in relation to COVID, that have been imposed on people. How do you think COVID has affected policing generally?
It's not positive, that's for sure. And again, what could possibly go wrong with this answer? I won't get into much trouble. But the thing is, I think police have been asked to do a hell of a lot more that perhaps they shouldn't have had to. I think other government departments should have been given more of a role, like health, for instance. And police have become sort of, there's 15 or 20 years in New South Wales of bridge building to communities that's probably been damaged a little bit. And it's not the police, it's not their fault because they're doing what they need to do and they've been told to do. Some of the fines that have been given out, I think a lot of people are very angry about that. And you would have seen the footage out of Melbourne where that woman, the pregnant lady in her pajamas, was arrested and dragged away in front of her husband and kids for having posted a post on Facebook saying that she was against the clampdowns in Melbourne. I never thought I'd see that in Australia, and I'm not passing judgment on anyone, but these are the times we live in. I hope at the end of this, some recognition is given to the fact that by governments, that police must be allowed to sort of go back to their traditional role of only tackling the bad guys, not Joe Citizen. And that's really what the problem is here. They're dishing out $1,000 tickets to people who have never done anything wrong in their lives, who have probably been pro-authority and pro-government all their lives. And that will linger. And I mean, you'll see some of that. Maybe you'll see it in jury verdicts down the track. We used to say that in murder trials or other trials, there's always one guy on the jury you wouldn't convict because he got booked by the Highway Patrol last week or something. And I don't know whether that's going to happen. I hope it doesn't, but it has had a negative effect that I think will take some time to dissipate.
It's been described in some quarters as a kind of militarisation of the police. Do you see it going that far?
I wouldn't call it militarisation. I mean, they didn't change their tactics or equipment or get more heavy weaponry or anything like that. But it was just that the things they were asked to do, most importantly, the people they were forced to take action against are not people that police should normally take action against. They're just normal citizens who perhaps really object to this whole new world that we live in. And it's strange. None of us have done this before. It just came out of left field, and unfortunately it's going to be with us for a while.
Nonetheless, these are regulations. Police job is to enforce regulations, right? Sometimes these regulations can be good and sometimes they can be bad, but it's still a police force's job to enforce them, right?
Yeah, it is, unfortunately, yeah.
And that brings, in your mind, down the track problems for the relationship between the community and police.
Yeah, and I think that will have to be, and almost certainly will be addressed by those in power, that at some stage down the track there's going to have to be extra effort at getting back to a sort of level relationship with the communities.
How have you seen policing change since you left? Is there a shift?
There's been many shifts. So I just worked out next year it will be 40 years since I went into the police academy. You can imagine what's happened in 40 years. I started at Balmain in the inner west. It was, there was basically a painters and dockers suburb at that stage. They were just beginning to leave. It's become quite trendy. I do wish I bought real estate back then in Balmain. But the police have probably, the thing that has struck me the most is changing regularly. It's like a pendulum that sort of goes back and forth. In the early 80s, they said we can't be a force. They called us a service, and we began to get more sort of touchy-feely, group hugs, Combaye, and all that sort of stuff. And then others came in and said, no, we're going back to being a force, and we are a force, and we must be feared, and we will clamp down on crime and talk tough and do all of those things. And then we went back again towards the, we didn't change the name again, thankfully, because it cost a lot in stationery and uniforms. But I think we're back to force again, and we're staying as a force. It's that has probably changed the most. And there's been a lot of research and a lot of academic thinking and writing about what police forces ought to do. Ultimately, my view is police should have a contract with the community. We will do the right thing and we will keep you safe, and hopefully you will cooperate with us and value what we do. And sometimes that is really, works really well and it's in existence. And then other times it runs off the rails. I'm sorry to digress, I look at what's happening in the US at the moment. It's completely off the rails. That contract's completely broken. A lot of the public don't have faith in the police, and a lot of police feel they've been unfairly, and in some cases they have been, tarnished by the deeds of the few. There's no doubt there's bad things happening. They're committed by the police. There's no doubt about it. The death of Floyd, I think, is inexcusable, and we have to call it for what it is. But there are a lot of good police who go out, every day, who do their best and have never done anything wrong, who are now seen as sort of being as part of some kind of, organised crime group.
And a movement to definance the police.
I could never. I'm not sure if they're talking about shutting them down altogether or simply not giving them enough money to do their job properly. And either way, that's not really the problem. I think you could talk to police organisations about having more community engagement programs, sensitivities type training, all those sorts of things are important. And some places have done it very well in the US and they're models for that, others not so well. But I don't think shutting them down and taking their money away is really the answer. And in Australia, it's 911 in America, AAO here. I don't think anyone in this room would want to ring AAO and say, no, we're sorry, we're closed, you're on your own.
Just on a day-to-day policing basis, smartphones are everywhere, so that everything any member of the police does is liable to be seen, videoed by someone. Does that make a difference to how police operate?
Absolutely. And I remember talking to the riot squad in Sydney not long before I retired, and they'd had a couple of issues, nothing major, but I just said to them, you must accept that every time you leave this building and go out to do your job, if there's 50 people standing around in the street, you can treat them as 50 Channel 7 cameramen. Everyone will film everything. Everything will end up on the internet. So essentially, you've literally, it does make things not harder, but you just need to be a lot more cautious of what you say and do, because any unguarded comment, any action, whether it's good or bad or whatever, you can count on it being put out there, and you can count on being held to account a lot more than it was in 1981. It's not all a bad thing, but it is in some ways it's restrictive in that people are almost too scared to do what they may want to do sometimes in terms of wrestling a bad guy or whatever, but they don't want to make that decision because they're worried about how it's going to be interpreted. When it's recorded, it's often, we've found in a number of cases, it was edited before it was placed on the internet so that the bits that justify what happened are removed, and it looks like it was just somebody that got an idea in their head and went and did something really bad. They're all things that I think there's a lot more pressure on police today, particularly young police in general duties or the highway patrol who are out on, where the rubber meets the road every day of the week, because they are so accountable in so many more ways than they were 40 years ago. Apart from the electronic aspect, as you mentioned, there is so many reporting requirements to so many bodies outside the police that you could almost spend your whole shift typing and not do what they're supposed to do.
And also, as we've seen in numerous cases, young police having to account for split-second decisions in moments when they find themselves in peril. That's very difficult.
It is. And this is the thing that I actually get quite upset about this. So somebody in the middle of an absolute bun fight makes a decision, good, bad or indifferent. And then they spend months, sometimes years, agonising over whether he did the right thing or not. And they have QCs and they have judges look at it. And they spend months deliberating and discussing every movement that happened. And they come to a conclusion he's done the wrong thing. Now, if it took them that long, this poor person, this man or woman, has had to make a split decision. They don't really factor that in often. Sometimes they do, but there's been some really bizarre decisions from the oversight bodies where they expect someone to have done a whole lot of deliberation when something has happened and they've had to react. And if they had not reacted, the consequences would have been much worse.
Mm-hmm. You had, I think it's 8 years on the Australian Counter-Terrorism Committee, am I right?
Yeah.
You had top Five Eyes security clearance. Would you like to share with us what you think is the top security threat facing Australia today?
I think it has to be jihadi terrorism. However, and that is the main threat. I don't think anyone can deny that. But there is an emerging threat, and it's been there for quite a while, and I don't think we're perhaps doing enough about it, and that's right-wing extremism. And it seems to have got a lot more oxygen, I have to say, since Trump was elected. There are people in Australia who have online joined with groups that are sympathetic to that view, and I see it as a real threat. I'm not saying you've got to keep it in context. It's not as big a threat as the much broader, much more international threat of jihadi terrorism, extreme fundamentalism, but it is something that I think authorities in Australia have to deal with. ASIO have spoken about this extensively. They see it as a threat, and going back to the 80s, I'm aware that they were monitoring that side of the threat. And, I have said in a couple of opinion pieces that I think we need to do more in that space. Very quick example. I don't know how we're going for time. No one's waving at me yet.
No, okay.
But the American, in America, they've got something like 15, 16, maybe 17,000 police agencies now, from one-man sheriff departments to huge police departments like New York, the biggest in the world and so on. The FBI publishes an annual report on hate crimes. They actually gather the data from all the agencies and report on the whole of the US. And the old axiom in policing is if you can't measure it, you can't deal with it. You're not really going to have, an insight into what the heck's happening, the trends and so on. In Australia, we have 8 police forces, just 8. And yet none of them actually record that information. None of them have a system that talks to each other, that collates it. And no one is actually, if something happens, bad graffiti painted on a synagogue or a Muslim woman attacked for wearing a hijab, it's down as malicious damage to property or an assault. There isn't really a category across Australia that deals with hate crimes against minorities and so on. And I think that's a failing on our part because we're not measuring how bad it may be or may not be. It may not be bad. But there are independent groups in the community who try to do that, but they don't have access or the sort of access I think you really need for gathering that sort of data. And I think if you're just not measuring it, you're not really aware of what, the trends and how big it is. So you can't really deal with it effectively.
And why do you think we do have that, what you would regard, I guess, as a blind spot? Why are we not more interested in
I guess, just to quote Winston Churchill, who used to talk about the Americans, he says, they can always be counted on to do the right thing after they've tried all other options. And I think we're trying all other options at the moment, and we'll eventually get to do the right thing.
Okay, so I think this might be a good moment. I don't know whether any one of you has been incubating a question while we've been chatting. Yes, look, there's one there. Well, what we're not doing is handing out microphones for COVID reasons. So if you'd like to stand up maybe and speak as loudly as
what
you
they
can.
did in the last session is the person who sat in your seat repeated the question for the Zoom.
Well, I can try and do that as well if you're not heard. Oh, okay.
It's not a Dorothy Dixer, but it's a topic near and dear to my heart. Thank you. The question was, how important is it that police have minorities and communities among them, recruited and joined and all that? We did a lot of effort in that space. I sort of used to be Exhibit A in many ways. There's a couple of people here who worked with me in that space who helped me greatly in that space. It's about convincing minority groups, ethnic and otherwise, to see the benefit of having members of their community join. We did not a lot, we didn't do enough research into what was happening in that space. We did increase the intake. We set out to attract people from the Asian community, from the Arabic community, all the migrant communities, and we held recruitment days and we had stuff on the internet and all of that to try and recruit people to join the cops. It is absolutely essential, to answer your core question. I think a police force that reflects the community it serves, the more accurately that is, the better they'll be prepared to deal with and understand and empathise with the community, particularly when there are crises. So my sense, and I've been gone 3 or 4 years now, is that we had increased the intake of people from those communities, but they were leaving within 5 or 6 years. They were not staying. And of course, when you leave the police, you're supposed to do an exit interview and they ask, what are you unhappy about? Why did you go? Hardly anyone does it. No one wants to say anything bad. I did my own, as you'd expect, due diligence, and just spoke to a few of the guys who had left, and they basically felt that there were racist tones in the mealroom. Sometimes they were copying it from the community, and they just didn't want to do it anymore. And I really regret that I really couldn't, or didn't really fix that. And I don't know that any one person can, but it is essential, in my view, for police to do their best, not only to engage with communities, but to attract as many as they can from those communities into their numbers. I look at the US again, and I think areas where they have a police chief who is African-American and large number of staff who are from that community, I think they have less problems in those places. It's a reality. If you reflect the community you serve, those among you who understand why this is happening will tell you, hang on, that's not what you think it is. It's this or this or this.
Mm-hmm. I have a question here that was handed to me, which is from an anonymous questioner. Can you identify a point at which the police force became more political in the sense of being more aligned to the government, perhaps more than was once the case? The position of commissioner seems to become increasingly politicised. What say you?
Yeah, what could possibly go wrong with that question as well? Gosh. I'd probably say the mid or late 90s in New South Wales, things changed dramatically. We had a commissioner called Peter Ryan came in who did many good things, but he didn't understand the New South Wales environment. And he clashed with the government, and his deputy certainly clashed with the government, Jeff Jarrett. Jeff Jarrett sued the New South Wales Police. These are all matters of public knowledge. And they had to settle because they didn't have a leg to stand on. They'd broken all the rules in how they sacked him and so on because he didn't fit in with the government's view of things. They then brought in what is commonly called the Jarrett Amendment, which is essentially legislating that the government of the day can sack the commissioner or any of the senior executive staff, assistant commissioner or above, and you cannot sue. You cannot sue. No matter what they do to you, you cannot sue when you leave. Now, just think about that for a minute. The Independent Office of Constable, the Westminster system, the separation of powers, dead. Essentially, and I'm not saying this happens every day of the week, but police and senior police, the executive, through no fault of their own, are now at the mercy of the government of the day. Their contracts may not be renewed. They may let them serve out there. You get 5-year contracts usually, or they may actually remove you altogether, and there is nothing you can do about it. I think it's that for me is the crux of the problem. And there is no doubt that policing has become quite politicised. What has also happened, in my view, and again, very controversially, is governments generally now tend to want the person they appoint to as police commissioner or the senior people to be someone who will never disagree with them, who will do exactly what they want, and who will perhaps not really stick up for the rank and file or for what's right. And I think Gary especially talked about moral courage, doing what's right sometimes, even though you know it's going to cause you grief, but yet you still do it because it's the right thing to do. And I don't see enough of that, in my view, in policing.
Do you think that you were, in inverted commas, a victim of politics in your time?
I don't think there's any doubt about that. I was a victim of a botched sort of internal affairs, police integrity commission operation. This is all public knowledge. And there's 114 of us that were illegally bugged. That's all been proven. But not some of them, so we had an inquiry into the bugging, which turned into an inquiry into who revealed the wrongdoing, not what happened all those years before. And some very close friends of mine were absolutely bastardized by that inquiry, had nervous breakdowns. One fellow ended up falling out of the witness box and being, they had to get an ambulance to take him away. That's the force, again, no right to silence, secret hearings, stuff that is really Stalinist Russia was happening in Sydney. So what I was told repeatedly, if you kick up a stink, you'll never be commissioner. I forced a parliamentary inquiry into what was happening, and guess what? I didn't become commissioner. But I don't, you know what I regret? Nothing. I'd do it all again if I had my time over again. It was the right thing to do, and it was for those who could not stick up for themselves. It is still wrong. It's never been righted, and successive governments and successive premiers are well aware of what's happened here, but they won't do anything about it. It's all part of the system.
Just a very quick question on your last answer. Do you believe that that is the principal reason why you were not made New South Wales Police Commissioner?
I'll never know, but I think it was one of the main reasons, if not the main reason. I was seen as someone who was going to do what I thought was right, even if it hurt the government. And I think that's what police and senior police and commissioners ought to do. That if it's not right, you can't do it just because a premier or a minister asks you to do it. It's that slippery slope that Gary Jubilant talks about, where you do a small favour and it becomes a bigger favour, and the next thing you know, you're just doing whatever the hell they want. And I honestly don't think, I remember Louis Freer, who's a good friend of mine, former director of the FBI, when the FBI was forced to investigate Clinton for a whole bunch of things, including the Monica Lewinsky thing and all that, he refused to accept the pass to get into the White House because it meant he didn't have to sign in and no one could tell when he came and went. He wanted every contact recorded. He wanted to be on a level where he's not palling around with the president who he's actually having to investigate. And to me, that's the moral compass. It's about saying, I'm not going to be your friend. I don't need to be your friend. And I shouldn't be your friend. I need to, exercise my duties and carry out the law in a frank and fearless way without worrying about, well, is it going to upset this minister or is it going to upset that premier? It shouldn't really be what decides what police do, but it often is.
Implicit in your comments is a criticism of the current executive hierarchy of the police. Do you intend it to be that?
No, I didn't. And there's a lot of really good people really trying hard, battling against a system that in many ways is stacked against them. None of them were responsible for this legislation, but they are all at peril of, the pleasure of the government.
Okay, look, I'd be remiss if I didn't go to this question from Greg Moriarty on domestic violence. Is it time to treat it as organised crime to get a stronger response?
Look, it's a very, very serious crime, and unless things have changed, my memory is a female, usually, not often male, dies every week at the hands of her partner in Australia. And I just find that astounding. It's not an organised group, but with organised crime investigations, you actually investigate a group and you look at their assets and how they're functioning as a team, and you try and break all that up, smash them basically. Unfortunately, you can't do that with domestic violence. I think more focus is always welcome in that space. I think more effort about prevention is definitely a very good thing, but I don't think you can adopt the organised crime methods of investigation to tackle that, because they're not a group. They're not talking to each other. They just each do it at home. It's a dreadful situation. I mean, I've got daughters and I've got a wife, and I don't know how it gets so bad with people that this sort of stuff happens, but it does, and it's a reality. And the police have done an awful lot in that space. And then there's been legislative change where even if women change their minds later on and say, no, it never happened, they actually video record now the initial contact and the initial complaint, and the court's allowed to use that under this legislation, even if the person retracts her statement because of pressure and all the usual things that happen afterwards.
Okay, I think we are really running out of time. If that's a quick question, we'll have that one. Thank you.
Yesterday, talking about the security state, said that ATO has never prosecuted a single spy in 70 years. What would you do with the resources of the intelligence organisations in Australia?
Okay, so let me just go to that question for our online audience. The charge made by the writer, investigative reporter Brian Toohey, is that ASIO has never prosecuted a single spy. what would you, Nick, do with the resources, intelligence resources?
Can I just clarify? Never prosecuted a spy working for a foreign government in Australia, or prosecuted one of their own? Or both? Sorry. I think they're doing a great deal already, and I think by and large they do a fair job. The one thing they perhaps, if I was God, what I would do is get them to be more open about things. There are a lot of things they can and should talk about that they probably don't, and their engagement with law enforcement could always use more. A lot of it is on a very personal basis where you've got to know someone for 20 years, and I had that for all those years, and in the Olympic Games and so on. It was all built on personal relationships where you knew someone, they got to know you, they trusted you, and then the next thing you know, the relationship and the cooperation and the exchange of information became more smooth. I'd probably do a little bit about that. But I don't know why, and I wasn't aware that they had never prosecuted anyone for spying for a foreign government, if that's what he meant. I'm not sure why that would happen, because there's certainly been people here who have done bad stuff.
Look, on that, I think we are going to have to call a halt to this really terrific discussion, Nick. Thank you so much for all those perspectives from all those parts of the world and from Australia as well. Would you please thank Nick?
Thank you.